There is one habit almost every beginner rider learns early on. It starts as a safety technique and it works pretty well, until one day it makes you lose control of your bike and crash. That habit is unnecessarily pulling in the clutch. At the very beginning, it actually makes sense, and it even saves brand new riders from complete disasters. Since pulling in the clutch disconnects the engine from the rest of the transmission, it can act like a very good failsafe against jerky throttle. If, let's say, in this situation, the rider would manage to just pull in the clutch, this spectacular crash simply wouldn't happen. However, once a rider gets past that initial stage, learns how to ride a bit and can control the throttle better without sending him into a whiskey throttle journey, that same safety habit quietly becomes a problem. Automatically pulling in the clutch in any sketchy situation severely reduces the amount of control of our bike and can easily cause both minor tip-overs and more serious crashes. So today, let's look at a few common cases where riders tend to pull in the clutch, why it backfires, and what to do instead. My name is Andrei Bodrov, I am your favorite speech-impaired motorcycle instructor here on YouTube, and also I make online courses that help people build real riding skills and confidence on the bike. Our flagship program, King of the Road, includes over 40 practical exercises that strengthen every major riding skill and make them work together, transforming you into a much safer, more confident rider in just 9 weeks. By the end of it, I can guarantee you'll ride better than most people who've been riding for years. If that sounds like something you'd want, check the link in the description. Let's start with probably the most common cause of all minor drops and tip-overs at slow speeds. It usually goes somewhat like this. A rider begins a slow-speed maneuver, like a U-turn. Then, at some point, the bike leans a bit further than he expected, the rider feels like he is losing the balance, and in that moment of panic, he pulls in the clutch, and sometimes also grabs the brake, for good measure. The bike, which is already unstable at this point, instantly loses its remaining speed and decides to take a quick nap on the ground. What actually happens here is simple. The moment the clutch is pulled in, the engine becomes disconnected from the rear wheel, and the power that could balance the bike completely disappears. The bike loses what little forward momentum it had, and gravity takes over. Instead, when at slow speed the bike starts to lose its balance, instead of pulling in the clutch, the correct reaction is exactly the opposite. The rider needs to add a bit of power on the rear wheel, not remove it. That brief acceleration helps the bike stand itself back up. For this reason, while riding at slow speeds, we usually use the so-called friction zone technique. We keep a small amount of throttle open and use the clutch to control our speed. Pull it in slightly to slow down, release it a bit to accelerate and stand the bike up again. It's the exact opposite of what most beginners in panic mode tend to do. But once we develop that muscle memory, the improvement is quite dramatic. It becomes almost impossible to tip over our bike, regardless of how much does it weigh or how tight the turn is. To actually develop this muscle memory, there is a whole bunch of exercises, a lot of which you've probably seen on my channel. Here is one which illustrates pretty well how quickly a bike can stand up as soon as it gets some momentum. First thing we need to do is to find exactly the point where the clutch starts to engage, the biting point. It's pretty easy to do, just release the clutch very slowly until the bike just starts to creep forward. That's the biting point. Now pull it in past this biting point a tiny bit, so you know the clutch is disengaged and the engine is disconnected from the rear wheel. Next, open the throttle to raise the RPM. It should be somewhere around 3 times the idle value. Then, turn the handlebars and lean the bike like this, after which quickly release the clutch into the friction zone and you'll see how the bike immediately stands up. You don't need to release the clutch a lot, there is maybe 10 mm of movement. as long as you remember to keep the throttle open, this will be more than enough to pick the bike upright. Don't dump the clutch, otherwise you are risking spinning the rear wheel like this. Again, all you need is to release the clutch a little bit into the friction zone. Once you learn to pick the bike upright quickly like this, you can go even further. Now, instead of just picking up the bike, try to release the clutch just the right amount. So your bike don't just spring upright, but don't fall down either. Ideally, if you manage to hit the exact right spot, you can start turning like this, with your handlebars turned all the way to the full lock, and you should be able to keep it locked and do circles by just finding the exact amount of clutch. But that's a bit more advanced skill. My main point here is that if you can have a good amount of control over your clutch instead of just pulling it in panic, you'll also have much more precise control over your whole bike at slow speeds. Now, let's look at the next common situation where new riders tend to pull in the clutch unnecessarily. It happens during braking. At the very beginning, again, this habit actually makes sense. When a rider is just learning how to bring a bike to a controlled stop, he usually does braking from rather slow speeds, let's say around 10 or 15 miles per hour. In this case, the bike stops very quickly, and without pulling in the clutch, the engine would simply stall. So new riders are basically trained to pull in the clutch almost at the same time as the front brake, and that becomes muscle memory. But once a rider starts braking from higher speeds, this habit brings more problems than benefits. For example, if during braking the rider immediately pulls in the clutch, the engine becomes disconnected from the rear wheel. The bike loses engine braking completely. It is not a huge deal by itself, but there are a couple of hidden problems with it. First, if we are just applying the front brake only, we have no braking on the rear wheel whatsoever. On bikes with shorter wheelbase, we can easily just use engine braking instead of the rear brake. Since under braking on short bikes all the way goes forward anyway, we don't need much braking in the rear wheel. We can simply use engine braking and concentrate all our attention on the front brake without thinking about the rear one too much. Now, if we are using both front and rear brakes, we encounter another problem. If we pull in the clutch right at the beginning of our braking, the rear wheel disconnects from the engine. This makes it much easier to lock up if you push the brake even a little bit too hard. If we leave the clutch be during braking, the engine stays connected to the rear wheel and our margin of error with the rear brake becomes much bigger. This is a very simple thing to test for yourself. Simply try to brake a few times on a straight line while applying a good amount of rear brake. You'll see for yourself that with the clutch pulled in, it's far easier to skid the rear wheel. Now, let's say our bike has ABS, and we don't worry about locking up the rear brake, since the electronics will take care of it. In this case, we still have one more problem to deal with, again related to engine braking. Let's say we're braking with our clutch pulled in. What would happen if, let's say, our clutch cable snaps? Sure, it doesn't happen often, but still it can happen. Now we will suddenly have a strong, unexpected jolt of engine braking out of nowhere, which would probably not inspire any confidence. On the other hand, there is simply not much reason to pull in the clutch during braking, except when we either come to a complete stop, in which case we pull it in at the last meter or so, or if we want to downshift, in which case we can either downshift after we're done with braking, or if we're feeling fancy, we can do downshifting with rev matching, in which case we always stay in correct gear and literally spend mere moments with the clutch disengaged. So, considering all this, braking in a straight line with the clutch in right from the beginning is simply not the best practice. It doesn't give us any benefits, but we completely lose engine braking, and it sets us up for very easy rear wheel lockups and makes us very vulnerable to the clutch cable failure. And now we get to one more common case where new riders tend to overuse the clutch. But before we go there, I want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor, Ultramax Cell, the high-tech base layers you've probably seen me wearing in some of my videos. What makes Ultramax Cell gear stand out is their unusual material, a unique polypropylene fiber with a 3D honeycomb structure. This design provides a compression fit that keeps the base layer snug and helps your body stay comfortable in both hot and cold weather. In the heat under ventilated gear, it pulls moisture away from your skin quickly and boosts evaporative cooling. In the cold, that same honeycomb structure traps more warm air around your body, keeping you insulated much better than regular thermals. Ultramax Cell is a nice step up compared to standard base layers. If you want to treat yourself to some extra comfort during your riding, check the link to their store in the description to this video. And now let's get back to our video. I kept the worst mistake for the last. While pulling in the clutch during a U-turn can make us drop our bike, and during straight line braking it can startle us with unexpected engine braking, it would not probably make us crash hard. Pulling it in during cornering, though, very much can. Just like with two previous cases, a habit of pulling in the clutch in corners stems from initial training. When we are riding around the training course at 5 miles per hour using our clutch is okay, but during higher speeds this habit carries significant risks. Basically, we have the same problems as we discussed in previous part of the video, but now they are amplified by the fact that our bike is leaning. For example, let's say we are doing some long turn, like on a cloverleaf interchange or something like that. Let's say as we enter the turn, we pull in the clutch out of habit. Now, at this very moment, nothing disastrous happens yet, but now we become vulnerable to several unpleasant things. First, again, imagine if the clutch cable snaps. We will suddenly have abrupt engine braking, which, considering the fact that our bike is leaning, can easily skid the rear wheel and send us into the high side. Second, what if at some point during this turn we want to slow down? Just like when we were braking in a straight line, there is exactly the same problem. With the clutch pulled in, it is far easier to lock up the rear wheel. But while in a straight line it is not the end of the world, in a corner it highly likely means once again a trip to the high side wheel. Next problem is that at some point during our corner we will need to go back on the throttle again. So we are going to release the clutch, right? We'll have to release it butterly smooth. Any mistake will once again make the bike jerk. In this case, maybe not enough to high side, but still enough to throw us off our intended trajectory, which is not good either. In the end, just like during braking, pulling the clutch unnecessarily during corners gives us zero benefits, but introduces multiple potential points of failure, which is why the best practice is to remain in correct gear and not disconnect the engine. In general, we should use the clutch during shifting or when we need to stop completely, and for friction zone technique during slow riding. Pulling it in without any apparent reason is counterproductive. Make sure you don't do that. Now we're almost finished, but since we are already on the topic of clutch control, I'll recommend this video here, which is an extensive guide on how to use our clutch properly. If you happen to be a new rider who wants to learn how to ride properly, definitely give it a look. And on this positive note, it is time to wrap it up. Thank you for watching, ride safely and have a wonderful day. Bye!